Most women will never realize the storm that brews in a man's soul, not when she screams, not when she pleads, but when she finally goes silent. Silence is not emptiness. It is a mirror, and in the mirror of her absence, he begins to see everything he tried to outrun. Carl Jung understood that the unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in symbols, shadows, and what is left unsaid. So when a woman withdraws, when she no longer feeds a dynamic, when she no longer dances with his chaos, she becomes an archetype of the absent feminine, the anima removed. And that removal, that sudden stillness, disrupts the male psyche in ways few men are prepared for. He may not say out loud. He may laugh with his friends. He may even scroll through new distractions. But deep within, the silence cuts sharper than any goodbye ever could. Because when a woman goes silent, she removes not only her voice, but his reflection within her. You see, men don't always fall in love with a woman. They fall in love with the version of themselves they become in her presence. When she validates, when she nurtures, when she mirrors his potential, his power, his masculinity, he sees himself through her eyes. And so, when she becomes still, when her gaze is withdrawn, it's not just her attention he loses. It is his very sense of self. This is the ego's quiet panic, the psychological unraveling, the suppressed fear that perhaps he was never the man he thought he was. That without her, he is not as strong, not as admired, not as needed. Silence, then, is not passive. It is profoundly active. It does not yell. It summons. It summons the man's shadows, his abandonment wounds, his unprocessed grief, his maternal longing, his addiction to control. And in Jungian terms, her silence becomes the invitation to individuation. But not every man accepts that invitation. Some rage, some chase, some retreat into coldness, pretending not to care. But make no mistake, her silence echoes. It echoes into fragile caverns of his unclaimed psyche, bouncing off the walls of every lie he told himself. She's replaceable, he might whisper, but if she were, he would have moved on by now. She was too much. But what if she was exactly enough, and it was he who wasn't ready? You, the woman who has gone quiet, now out of cruelty, but out of clarity, you have triggered the collapse of illusion. And illusions never die peacefully. Because here's the truth no one tells you. When you stop speaking, you become louder than ever. Men hear that silence in strange places, in a song that reminds them of you, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the way other women don't look at him like you did, in the soft cruelty of knowing no one really sees him anymore. And that is what he thinks when you go silent. He thinks of all the times he should have listened but didn't. All the words he weaponized, the moments he dismissed your intuition as overreaction. He thinks of the last look in your eyes, that final glance that said more than any sentence could, the one where he saw your soul step back, your energy detach, your feminine no longer flowing toward him but inward, toward yourself. This is the sacred withdrawal, the feminine reclaiming her center, and it terrifies a man who is still tethered to ego, because now he cannot argue with you. He cannot guilt you, debate you, seduce you back into the game. You've taken the board with you. The game no longer exists. Silence is not a punishment. It is a boundary. And boundaries are the language of women who have learned to love themselves more than they need to be understood. This, then, is what stirs in the heart of a man when a woman withdraws into silence. Not hatred, not apathy, but a deep, unspoken regret, the kind that haunts. Because he did not lose your words. He lost the right to hear them. There's a moment, quiet, barely perceptible, when man begins to feel the weight of what has vanished. Not her body, not her presence in a room, but the invisible current that once flowed between them. That subtle, electric thread of feminine energy that once warmed his coldest days, that once made him feel like more than just a man now severed. And in its place, only silence remains. But it's not a blank silence. It's full of meaning, full of memory, full of everything unspoken. Carl Jung wrote that what we fail to bring to consciousness returns as fate. And so, when she goes silent, she doesn't simply disappear. She becomes faded in his mind, immortal, untouchable. This is a spiritual paradox. The more distance she creates, the more present she becomes inside his psyche. And what is it that truly unnerves him? It is not her absence, but her power, because in that silence, she has broken the pattern. She no longer feeds the loop. She no longer dances the trauma tango. And this, to the male ego, is unbearable. The ego feeds on validation, conflict, engagement. Even a fight is proof he still matters. But when she gives him nothing, no words, no reactions, no signals, he is left alone with the one person he's tried hardest to escape, himself. The masculine psyche, left unchecked, craves control, not because it is strong, but because it is terrified of chaos. And the spiritually awakened feminine is the chaos he cannot dominate, not because she's wild, but because she's free. You, the woman who has chosen silence, have become the unknowable. You've exited the arena. You've removed the mirrors. And now, he has nothing to bounce himself against. He begins to question everything. Did he misunderstand her softness as weakness? Did he confuse her patience with permission? Did he mistake her loyalty for dependence? What man thinks when a woman goes silent is not always logical. In fact, it's rarely logical. It's psychological. It's primal. It's laced with archetypes and suppressed needs. In Jungian terms, the anima, the unconscious feminine within a man, is activated not by pleasure, but by pain. And her silence is that pain. That crack in his psyche where light and shadow leak through together. He may not know these words. He may never study the maps of Jung or the codes of ancient philosophy. But his body knows. His heart knows. The same way it knew when she laughed and the room felt safer. When she touched his arm and his guard dropped just a little. When she listened without fixing him, loved him without conditions. And now that she's silent, every one of those moments becomes a sharp contrast against his present emptiness. There are men who will run from this pain. They'll project, replace, repress. But even in the arms of another woman, they'll hear the echo. They'll search for fragments of her scent, her stillness, her soul, in eyes that don't carry the same light. Because a woman who withdraws with grace is unforgettable, not because she made a scene, but because she became the scene he cannot stop replaying. And so, in the silence, he begins to bargain, not always aloud, not always consciously, but internally. He replays the final conversations, the signs he ignored, the tenderness he took for granted. He starts to wonder, not just what he lost, but why he couldn't see it when he had it. That question burns. It carves a hollow into the man who believed he was in control, because now he sees she was never asking for dominance. She was offering depth. She wasn't trying to trap him. She was trying to awaken him. But now she's gone quiet, not as a strategy, not to manipulate, but because she's done explaining her worth. She's done performing her pain for someone else's recognition. In this silence, something divine happens. She turns inward, not to sulk, but to rise. And that, above all else, is what shakes a man to his core. Not that she left, but that she's becoming more without him, while he is still haunted by the sound of her absence. In the absence of her voice, his thoughts become louder. The mind, once distracted by the rhythms of daily life, now fixates. Obsessively, irrationally. It is in this space, this aching silence, that the man begins to confront the true weight of the feminine. Not the surface level attraction, not the role she played in his story, but her energetic sovereignty, her capacity to love without losing herself, her terrifying ability to walk away without setting the world on fire, because she is the fire. Carl Jung knew the psyche does not seek comfort, it seeks wholeness. And nothing awakens that quest more brutally than the woman who refuses to explain her worth a second time. When she goes silent, she no longer participates in his illusions. She no longer softens the jagged edges of his immaturity. She no longer props up his potential. And the mask he wore, the one she silently tolerated, begins to crack. The man is forced to see himself in the raw. The insecurities he projected onto her, now staring back at him with nowhere to hide. The control disguised as love. The fear behind the dominance. The boy beneath the armor. You, the woman who withdrew, have triggered what Jung would call the breakdown of the persona. his public face, his curated identity, is no longer mirrored or reinforced by your gaze. And so, without your affirmation, he stumbles. Because the feminine is not just muse, it is mirror. Without it, the male psyche often becomes lost in its own maze. And yet he remembers. He remembers how she looked at him like he mattered. He remembers how her silence wasn't always silence. It was space, sacred space, space to speak, to stumble, to breathe. And now that same space becomes a vacuum that exposes everything he took for granted. What haunts a man is not her departure. It is her disengagement. She didn't rage. She didn't accuse. She simply withdrew her energy. And to the man who relied on her light to feel whole, that is devastating. Because he cannot replace what he never truly understood. Other women may come. They may say the right things. They may smile, touch, flirt, but they will not be her. Because she wasn't magnetic just for her beauty or her voice. She was magnetic because she was whole. Because she carried both heaven and shadow in her eyes. And love from a place that terrified him. She loved not be chosen, but because she had chosen herself first. And now, she has chosen again to fall silent, not to punish, but to preserve. Preserve her peace. Preserve her power. Preserve the sacredness of her spirit that was once bleeding through words he never heard. There's a kind of man who will rise from this. A man who will descend into the shadow Jung spoke of. A man who will weep, not for her loss, but for the parts of himself he abandoned long before she left. A man who will remember that love is not possession and silence is not absence. But most won't. Most will resent her silence, mislabel her distance as pride, her boundaries as coldness. Most will flee back into their comfort, half awake, half alive. But the silence stays. It lingers in the background of every conversation that doesn't touch his soul. It flickers in every hollow compliment. It returns in every dream where her face appears without warning. Because she didn't just walk away, she transcended. And that, he realizes too late, is what truly breaks him. She didn't leave because she stopped loving. She left because he couldn't meet her where she already was, on the edge of transformation. There's a difference between weaponized silence and sacred silence. And the psyche feels a difference like heat versus light. Weaponized silence seeks control. Sacred silence seeks center. What unsettles him is that hers is the latter. It denies him no truth. It only denies him access. In that boundary, his unhealed patterns begin to show themselves with ruthless clarity. Projection grows restless. Without her voice to collide with, he argues with a phantom, an inner figure wearing her face. Jung called this a return of the repressed, the dreamlike takeover of the unowned self. The man, deprived of her living presence, negotiates with his own anima in the dark and discovers she does not yield to charm, pressure, or bravado. He reviews the choreography they once danced, a text unanswered, a story viewed but not replied to, the cadence of conversations that used to rescue him from emptiness. With the mirror gone, the persona falters. The confident mask that performed competence begins to slip. Beneath it lives a boy who learned that love is something to be convinced of, not something to be met as an equal. The silence exposes this, not with accusation but with absence. Absence, as an archetype, is not mere lack. It is negative space, the divine outline that reveals the shape of what was never fully formed. He reaches for substitutes. Noise, novelty, work, bodies, scrolling, bravado. Yet each substitute lands like a copy of a sacred text printed without ink. Desire persists, but meaning has vanished. That is the sting of anima deprivation, not hunger, but hollowness. He begins to understand, dimly, that what held him was not approval but presence. Her presence carried both warmth and boundary, tenderness and truth. It was the rare union of the soft and the movable that invited him to grow without demanding a performance. You know this instinctively. That is why the silence stays. Not to coerce, but to consecrate. To consecrate the self that once bled out through explanations. The woman who has learned this distinction becomes formidable. She will not debate emotional reality with someone determined to win rather than connect. She will not mother a man masquerading as a partner. She will not translate her intuition into courtroom evidence for a jury that benefits from her doubt. She will step back, and the act of stepping back becomes theology. It teaches him the liturgy of consequences. Shadow work arrives precisely here. The man feels the old ache that predated her by years, sometimes decades. The mother wound that turned attention into oxygen and withdrawal into suffocation. The father wound that confused respect with fear and leadership with control. He may lash out, seeking to place the discomfort back into her hands. But the Stoics spoke of the one territory that remains sovereign, judgment. Events are neutral until meaning is assigned. Her silence gives him back the pen. He must write the meaning. He must decide whether it is abandonment or initiation. If he takes the path of initiation, he descends. The descent is not glamorous. It looks like nights without anesthesia, honest inventory, apologies without bargaining, therapy that burns pride like incense. It looks like refusing to stalk her life from the periphery, refusing to bait her into reaction, refusing to project blame where responsibility is owed. It looks like honoring the boundary as an altar, not a prison, an altar where the old boy self is laid down so a man can rise. He learns that love without self-mastery is appetite in costume. He learns that attraction without integrity corrodes into obsession, and obsession without humility becomes violence against the soul. Meanwhile, the feminine keeps vigil with herself. No spectacle, no announcements. Rituals of return. Sleep that finally repairs. Breath that goes all the way down. Friendships that are not gossip but sanctuary. Work that honors her gifts instead of punishing her sensitivity. Movement that makes the body feel like home again. She stops rescuing the past from reality. She lets memory be heavy and sets it down anyway. She forgives not to restore access, but to restore circulation of her own life force. The silence becomes generative. Ideas appear. Joy returns in small, precise ways. Morning light, a clean kitchen, laughter that doesn't require performance, music chosen for pleasure rather than the hope of being noticed. And so the polarity shifts. He once felt large and she felt small. Now he feels partial and she feels whole. Not superior, whole. The difference is not dominance, but density. She is dense with self-knowledge, dense with boundaries, dense with earned calm. He is dispersed by unknown desire. If he is willing, this contrast becomes a teacher more merciful than any speech. If he is unwilling, it becomes a haunting. Either way, the silence has done its work. It has revealed the truth that was covered by noise. The lesson moves forward with or without him. There comes a point in the silence when the man must decide. Will he remain a visitor in his own unconscious, or will he begin the journey inward, into the raw terrain where mirrors no longer flatter and masks no longer fit? This is the great threshold Jung spoke of, the place where projection dissolves and the self, naked, fragmented, and unfiltered, begs to be acknowledged. And the woman, still silent, remains a catalyst, not by force, but by refusal. Her refusal to shrink, her refusal to beg, her refusal to explain to someone committed to misunderstanding. This is not punishment. This is self-honoring. A woman who goes silent doesn't seek retribution. She seeks resonance. And when it's absent, she does what the wounded feminine rarely dares to do. She turns her love back inward. She stops outsourcing her reflection to someone else's perception. This is where she begins to rise, not as a performance, but as a return to what she was before she twisted herself into something legible for someone else's comfort. Her silence is not hollow. It is sacred space where the old patterns unravel, where trauma no longer scripts every interaction, where validation no longer determines value, where the drama of trying to be enough for someone who never truly saw her fades. And for the man, that silence is now deafening, because the world hasn't gone quiet, only she has. And in that precision, he begins to notice what her presence used to silence in him, his own inner chaos. Without her calm energy to center him, he hears the static again, the endless thoughts, the unresolved grief, the anxious clinging to identity. She was not his anchor. She was his invitation to ground himself. And he declined. Now, alone in the aftermath, he realizes something terrifying. She was not asking for more. She was asking for depth. She didn't need louder promises. She needed him to go with her, into his own soul, into the grief he hid, the rage he denied, the emptiness he pretended was ambition. But depth cannot be faked, and it cannot be bought with charm. Depth is the byproduct of descent, and the feminine, she no longer waits for him to descend. She no longer tries to guide him there. She understands now. Some men are more in love with their control than they are capable of intimacy, and that is the sharpest truth of all, because the silence she holds, this tender, piercing void, is not a wall. It's a mirror, a final offering, a last reflection of what could have been if he had chosen courage over comfort. But courage is rare, and most men are not taught how to feel without armor, how to love without conquest, how to stay present when it hurts. So they confuse detachment with dignity. They confuse avoidance with strength. And they only realize the cost when it's far too late, when the silence is not a phase, but a new reality. He watches from periphery now, watches her live, watches her glow from within, no longer contorting herself to be digestible. Her laughter now belongs to the air, not to him. Her beauty no longer seeks an audience. Her mind, sharp, mysterious, and vast, returns to its natural rhythm, uninterrupted by the constant need to explain its worth. She has become unconsumable, and that, more than anything, is what he thinks when a woman goes silent. He thinks of how much he missed, how much he misunderstood, how much he mistook her grace for fragility, her kindness for naivety, her emotional honesty for drama. And now, he will never hear her voice again, not in the way he used to, not in the way it called him to rise, because the silence once feared has become her sanctuary. And no man may enter without meeting her there, on sacred ground, barefoot and humbled. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.